the body is already saying those things that they know something is not right.
Sometimes I think with adults, there's this thing with our brains to almost think, oh, they're younger, they don't know what they're doing. Like, we'll just make this decision for them, whatever. And it's like, don't we all have a memory of being that age and being frustrated that someone was doing that for us?
To apply all of those in my work is seeing young people as different but not so different than me, of challenging those normal imbalances that the adult knows everything, the adult will decide.
Welcome to Secrets Worth Sharing, a series all about having difficult conversations on childhood sexual abuse, but with serious joy. I'm Sophia, the founder and director, and today we are talking about working with and researching children and young people. And for that, I can think of no one better than my friend and colleague, Janelle. Hi, Janelle.
Hi, I'm Janelle. I just recently finished my PhD here in Durham University, where I work with 26 amazing, brilliant young people here in Northeast England, 13 to 18 years old. So we work together on understanding sexual violence from their perspectives, and they decided on the methods, the topics, and they just led the way in the project in exciting and surprising ways. Prior to that, I work in the Philippines with child rights advocates on passing several laws. For instance, I worked in a policy research project where I led a team on working with members of Congress to increase the age of sexual consent from 12 to 16 years old. So that's been a landmark law in Philippine legislation. So aside from that, I'm really passionate about promoting young people's voices. I'm very excited and thankful for Sophia for inviting me today.
I can't believe you just dropped in the introduction that you changed the law. I have no idea that you were part of that.
I mean, I joined in one of the research projects I did was the legislators we used the policy brief that we developed in the debate. So it was really exciting to know how the research was used in like a impactful manner.
That's incredible. Oh, wow. I can't think of anyone better. Again, I just thought I'd touch a little bit on how we met. So we were both linked up with the Centre of Expertise on Childhood Sexual Abuse. And at the time, I was co-facilitating the REACT network, which is meetings for all people of colour in childhood sexual abuse who either are survivors or who work in the space. And you came along and did a speech about your PhD project. And after that speech, I was like, wow, this queen comes to every meeting, talks about the importance of including children and young people. You've always made a really strong point about we're all adults in this room talking about a situation that's affecting children today without them in the room. And again, it just is always the first and foremost of your mind. And then you gave that presentation and I was like, the world needs to hear this. So would you mind sharing with us a bit about your PhD and what it was you were researching?
The purpose really of the project is to hear what young people have to say on sexual violence, because most of the time the definitions, the laws, and even interventions or programs are decided by adults. But there's very little involvement of young people on what are their lived experiences and what are actually important to them. So my PhD, I focus on how do young people understand sexual violence. So I ask them, like, what are the things you would associate with it? What words would you describe your experiences? It was really transformative. They use the legal terms that adults typically use, like rape, sexual assault, but they also use everyday language like it feels weird, it feels uncomfortable. Just showing those two or complement each other is very important in understanding sexual violence from their perspectives and really just involving them. That some of the programs in schools tend to be top down and telling them that this is what should happen. But by involving them, they gave some very concrete and practical recommendations of, at least when they tell someone about something that happened, be transparent with them on how that information is used. So a lot of the values that are very important to them are transparency, consistent communication, which sometimes takes for granted because when adults, especially those involved in safeguarding decisions, have to act immediately, sometimes a step is lost in circling back to the young people of we had to make these decisions because of certain implications. So it's just so the project as a whole tries to show a way of involving young people of what matters to them and how can that lead to co-developing solutions.
One of the things that you talk about quite a lot in your work is the use of language. You showed us when you did your presentation this incredible map which highlights some of the language that younger people use. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we co-developed a model called Communicating About Sexual Violence. We found out that there are two languages, the language of harm and the language of discomfort. So the language of harm are those terms we use to describe sexual violence using legal terms, rape, sexual assault, or sexual harassment. So these are the terms that are commonly seen in policy and program and even in sex education. But alongside it is that young people experience a spectrum of behaviors. It's not only the ones which we understand to be severe and physical. They also experience a lot of everyday behaviors, like especially with other young people, someone calling them names in a sexualized manner or touching them inappropriately, which might not reach the serious threshold that safeguarding policies often use. So that for those experiences, they used effective emotional based language of this made me feel weird, this made me feel uncomfortable. And my study showed that oftentimes when they use those words, adults might not hear them or might not listen to them in a way of something has happened because they didn't say the language of harm. So by showing this model that came from young people's experiences, it shows that young people have these different ways of communicating, and it's up to adults to listen a bit differently on how young people might be talking about experiences which concern them, or they're confused if it's something that needs support. But the moment that they do talk about it, it's up to adults to listen and ask them, what would you want to do, what you want to happen. So I think this is what's missing now. Of some adults, meaning parents or teachers or social workers, might be more attuned to listening to the very serious stuff that we might overlook, the everyday stuff, but the everyday behaviors. But if those are left unattended, they could eventually escalate and it might be too late when we act on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And to share kind of a personal anecdote that really relates to this, when I came out about my abuse, I was 18, so I was legally an adult at that time. And this is when I was speaking about, to parents and carers and guardians and things like that. And a guardian figure in my life approached me, this was years later, and just said, "Oh, can I ask you a question?" I said, "Yeah, of course." And they said to me, "Oh, when you were younger, we went on a walk once, and you said to me that sometimes you found this person to be really weird. Were you trying to tell me something? Like, were you trying to tell me that?" And you know what was really interesting? My response was, actually, I don't think I realized that what I was going through at the time was formalized as abuse. I just tapped into the behavior that something was wrong. And you hear it all the time. And I've got kids that I'm responsible for in my life, not my own children, but others. And they often use the word weird. And it's about how do you tap into that in a safe and age appropriate way. And with really young kids, it's helping them to understand when you feel weird, what exactly, what parts of your body feel strange. Do you get butterflies in your stomach? Does that feels like nervousness? Does weirdness come from that you don't want to be around someone? And then just asking those gentle questions to help understand. And then even with teenagers, oh my days, I'm really going to show my age now, but I feel like younger teens nowadays say words like buki and things like that, words that older adults, we don't even really know what they're saying. And when slang is used, again, it can be easier to tap into the sort of fun side of language, and when something is fun or joyful, it can be easily played off. And obviously, we're all about serious joy in our platform. We're all about encouraging people to use the language that is comfortable to them, but it's also about tuning into where those languages can be dismissed. And I think your project did that really well, especially when you were talking about harmful language and safer language.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experience. And that's something which I've read in other research as well, and which informed a lot of my work, that survivors of child sexual abuse, especially when they talk about it later on in their adulthood, is they said they did try to tell somebody, but at the time there were so many things happening. First, they didn't know, as you said, what was happening to them could be abusive or harmful. And it's literally, as you said, of many were saying about bodily tension. Like the young people in my project, they talked about things like flinching or just feeling some goosebumps or shivers. Like the body is already saying those things, that they know something is not right. But the thing is, because the language that everyone is conditioned to use is it has to be serious to prompt action. They're like, who do I tell and how do I tell this? They might say I'm overreacting, or I'm sensitive. That's why it's good, as you were saying earlier, to have that gentle curiosity and sensitivity of if someone says, I think something feels odd, ask more, what do you mean by weird? Why is it weird? Which specific situations? Just that curiosity, which I think sometimes gets lost when some adults are attuned to listening to what I call like the alarm bells. If it's a fire alarm, I have to act now. But if it's like a whisper or someone that is just like ringing a small bell, or like, yeah, maybe that's not serious. So I think it's really good to be attuned, and for young people as well to communicate when something feels a bit off. And as you said, now so many things are normalized, so it's hard to know when something is off or not. But it's good to have that space to talk to others that maybe I'm not sure, like the space for uncertainty, and then just get the support that it's valid to feel that way, and you don't have to be touched, or you don't have to experience something serious to receive the support.
I love the analogy that you were using about fire alarms. And I think it stems from a culture of often believing that a difficult conversation, has to only happen once and that's it. Something bad happens, we have a big conversation about it, everyone understands what to do, and then we move on. And that is typically how, in so many cultures, we're trained to have these discussions, if we do at all. And I think I want to try and help us pivot to the idea that actually we have these conversations and we have them little but often, and then it makes the conversation less difficult, and two, it allows us to change our mind, to check in. The things that make you feel weird and uncomfortable one week might not be the same another week or another month, and things happen, systems develop. If a kid's going through their exams, and we know, like, you know, the pressure on kids for their schooling and education worldwide at the moment is so high. If they're going through that, they might not want to talk about the abuse at that certain moment, and it might be pushed to the side. But in the summer holidays, and I found this a lot, particularly when I was working with uni students, the summer holidays are such a pivotal time for people to reflect. And so it's also about when you choose to have those conversations. So if those conversations are more often, but less serious, then you're able to get to the crux of what actually is happening.
No, definitely. I totally agree with you of making it more of a conversation. And that's something which I've also heard from the young people, not only in this project, in my PhD, but another project I worked on peer sexual abuse in schools. What they said they wanted from their teachers was someone just to ask them if they were okay on a regular basis. So it doesn't have to be asking them if something was wrong, but asking how they're okay. But because they're used to those conversations of someone showing them concern and care on a regular basis, when something does happen, they've already built that trust and that consistency that this person really cares for me. And that's not to say that teachers don't care. We all know they're overburdened with pressures as well from institutions. But for young people, they really value it, and they see it when someone is asking them about them, like as a person, of how are you, and not just the common how are you, and then you expect not like I'm okay, but someone genuinely asking, are you okay? But something which I can talk about later, but just to say that, for example, for Filipinos, we have some values of like, we're attuned a lot even to body emotional cues and body language of, if someone says they're okay verbally, you would see that the language is not really, and that prompts us to ask, are you really okay? And that's when the conversation happens. But I think sometimes some people, due to if someone says they're okay, then it stops. But sometimes the gentle prodding makes the young person feel that they really care. I can trust them. I can tell them that something made me feel weird or something uncomfortable. So as I said, making it more constant and less serious and more embedded into our relationship building process is really important for anyone experiencing anything difficult, especially for young people, where it's a mix of many things. It could be about abuse, it could be about school, it could be about friends, but all of them concern them and they need someone to talk about it.
Absolutely. And sometimes when you're overwhelmed, you don't even know what thing is more of a cause than another. We often talk about, when we're doing social activism, you can't fight for a fairer and more just world without, also fighting for so many other social justice causes, right? I personally don't feel like there's any point in fighting for survivor advocacy and empathy and support if I'm not also fighting for trans rights, for rights of people of color, for all of those other things, because so much of it is an interrelated struggle. And I think especially if you're young and you're still figuring that out, you know, there's that and there's that added layer of actually I just want someone to hear me out, you know. Janelle, I'm so curious. Obviously, we're all aging all the time, you know, we're not getting any younger. I don't know if you define yourself as a young person, probably certainly not a child. How do you go about getting trust and engaging with people who are a younger generation to you to do this work?
I would love to consider myself a young person, but I think I passed that stage. But I think a lot of it is the way that I approach any work or any engagement with young people, maybe in research or before when I was doing some youth work or charity work. The first is really, and I think it really connects to the theme of your podcast of serious joy. It's very important to have that element of fun and game. So the first step I do in any relationship building with young people is to have games, get to know them. Food is also a very important part of connecting with young people, which is very closely aligned with Filipino culture and Asian culture in general. But it's starting in a space of I'm not coming to them just to get things done, because they're used to adults saying, or some research encounters of, we need the data, you need to give it to us then leave. But because of the participatory approach, for me, it's important to establish that relationship of trust by playing games, knowing that the time we spend together is not just for the activity, it's getting that in. Second is about ongoing consent. So consent is something which, of course, is among the ethical principles in research. But the way I practice it is that it's on a moment-to-moment basis, activity-to-activity basis. So there were times in my PhD when I asked the young people, do you still want to continue this session or this activity? And they, because of the trust we've developed, they know that they have a genuine space to say no, to say I'm tired or I cannot do it. I say, okay, we pause the session for the day, we continue it the next time. And that builds trust because, again, they know that they're being valued as people, that I'm not going to push them to keep talking just because I need it for my data. So once they know, and especially in encounters with adults, where it's usually the adult making the decision, for them to know that they can say no and that no will be respected is very important, especially if they have lived experience of abuse and violence. But even in other spaces, as a person, it's important to know that when you say no, people will respect it and not push it. And lastly is, among many others that I've done, is really feedback. So I keep asking them for like informal feedback at the end of every session. Like, how do you feel? Like, genuinely, how did it make you feel? What can we do better? And it's acting on that. Of when they say that this activity didn't work or that food didn't, even the little things of that game didn't work, it's like I take that in and then I apply that. So across all of this, it's first valuing them and as people and showing that my care and concern is genuine. It's not transactional just because I need to get the research done. And second is showing that I really listen to them genuinely, that when they say no, when they want things done differently, I will act on it. So I think that in all of the different projects that I've done, and based on their feedback, which validates the approach, they do appreciate that they are valued. That I remember one young person gave feedback of for the one of the very first times, they feel that they were listened to as adults and they were valued and genuinely respected, which is sad that they don't see that in other spaces, but also fulfilling that the approach has been useful for them, that when I say they are listened to, they do feel that, and they share the feedback to know that it is a process that's been valuable for them. So it's really listening. Even in the Philippines, some children and young people I've worked with in charities who are from disadvantaged backgrounds, I just take the time to just sit with them, talk to them, play any games. And after that, they say, thank you for giving us the time. Because usually adults would just be passing us by and being like, we have things to do. But they appreciate someone just giving the time to them to listen. And I think that's something which we might take for granted, but it's really very important for young people and anyone really to be valued and validated.
Sometimes I think with adults, there's this thing with our brains to almost think, oh, they're younger, they don't know what they're doing. Like, we'll just make this decision for them, whatever. Mm-hmm. And it's like, don't we all have a memory of being that age and being frustrated that someone was doing that for us? So I totally hear what you're saying there. It's funny because when I was thinking about doing an episode on talking with children and young people, I really wanted to interview an actual young person, right? And this is the kind of forever the dilemma with the childhood sexual abuse sector in general. But like, I really, really wanted to interview someone who was younger to tell their story. But of course, there's loads of like really personal challenges that come up with that, because you could be seen as like exploiting them by putting them on a platform online to show their story, even when that person is like, actually, I have the authority, I have the autonomy, I want to tell that story. And it's this really difficult line of like managing and balancing that and people's experiences with the fact that their age might legally be a reason why they can't speak. Like, you might believe that they are able and willing to consent to telling their own story and sharing their experiences, but then what would happen were the repercussions of that. And I wondered if you'd ever had similar challenges when doing this, because I thought, if I can't have an actual child come on, the next best thing is to talk to someone who works with them so much and so intensively. But I wondered if this was a dilemma you also had.
No, this is a constant dilemma that I have, and it's something that I totally relate. And it's something which I had to make a decision in the two projects where I worked with young people with lived experiences. So I made a conscious decision that I don't directly ask them for their experiences, but there's the space that if they do want to talk about it, they can. So what I usually do is we have hypothetical situations. They share their experiences through the characters. So in a way, they're not actually sharing it, but they have the autonomy that this character they think would do this or experience this, but we know that it is informed by their experience, but they don't have to disclose it directly. But also in other spaces, they can disclose if they want to. And I think it's just managing that space, not for the young person who disclose, but also with other young people on how, since a lot of, as you said, a lot of safeguarding and ethical issues. But for me, it's always giving them that choice that you don't have to share your story unless you want to. And there are different opportunities. And that's something which I've navigated, that because I get asked like, did you work with victim survivors? I would say they didn't identify themselves as victim survivors, and I didn't actually recruit them for that. But I said that if anyone can relate to having these experiences, they are welcome to join, or if they know someone. So I think that gives it more space for young people, that when they're joining the project, they might think they didn't have that experience. But then as we talk, they may say, oh, I do relate to that, but I'm not ready to share. But because of the different activities, what I call it is like experience informed sharing. So it's always informed by their experience, but they don't have to say this happened to me. And that's been helpful, I think, for some young people who have worked in the two projects on giving them the space and the choice when they can disclose, when they can share using another person, a hypothetical person's story, and giving those different. But as you said, it's always a lot of, and that's something which I've read as well in other research, where young people are always very keen to share about their story because they know it's going to help other people. But sadly, some of it are institutional, that ethics boards and applications will be like, no, that's too that's too much. It's just balancing that on giving them the autonomy and space, but always making sure safeguards are included. So
I think what you're talking about is really, really similar to, sometimes people go to therapy of any age. People of any ages go to therapy. And the golden rule of therapy is your session is confidential unless we have reason to believe that, one, you're going to say something that will harm other people, as in, physically cause a lot of harm, or two, that you will cause destructive harm to yourself. Therefore, and when there's children and young people involved, the kind of added caveat to that in the UK is, if you tell us that you are someone who thinks they've experienced sexual violence and you name who it is, we have a duty to report up. And I'm sure you've come across that when you've been doing your research ethics. And what some therapists do is kind of create a roundabout situation, exactly as you have, where they say, if we're to hypothetically talk about a situation of abuse where X, Y, Z happens, what would you do? How would you feel as this person? And it allows the person to feel like they can share their story in an anonymous and safe manner without it being instantly escalated, where they might not be ready to have that conversation. So what I really love about your approach is that you did say, you don't have to have experienced this, or if you have a similar thing or you think you might have gone through this sort of experience, then you're welcome, and we're not going to directly ask you about that. And that keeps them safe, but it also keeps you safe as the practitioner as well. I wanted to move to talk about care-based practice because you've hinted about it quite a few times already, and we know that care-based practice is so pivotal to the work that you do. Would you mind telling us a little bit about how you understand that word?
Yeah, so for me, care is something which is core to who I am as a person, as a Filipino, and how I engage with young people and other people in general. And I think it's good to compare it with traditional ethics, like in when doing research or even in practice of there are some guidelines that we need to meet, of course, making sure everyone is safe, following consent and anonymity, confidentiality, which we talked about briefly. But the ethics of care takes that further, and a care-based practice takes it further by recognizing the relationship as the core of the engagement of how do we make sure that the well-being of the young people and the practitioner or researcher is prioritized. So for a practical example is on consent, that so traditionally it could just be like people send the consent form and they're fine and they will follow it. But a care-based practice which I reflect on and I embody is that how do I prioritize young people's well-being when at any point they may want to opt out, or if they want to say that I don't want to join the project anymore, or they don't feel comfortable talking about some things, because there's a tension for research that anytime you pause or stop the data collection, then it might derail the project, it might affect the quality of the data. But for me, I always say that my priority is young people's well-being. So if they say that they don't want to continue or they feel uncomfortable, I say, okay, we stop, we play a game, we do something else. And I think that's a way that it's very important for working with young people, especially on sensitive topics, on how do we practice care and concern. So this is all very grounded on my Filipino values, that we have several virtues, which, like for example, pakikiramdam, or what we call relational sensitivity, where we look at the body cues, body language, and even just knowing through the relationship how they might say something but mean something else, and prodding that. So for me, care-based practice is really caring for others, showing concern, empathy, and sensitivity beyond what is required in the research and then encounter with with young people. I think it is something which I can see, of course, in youth work, social work, and other practices and other disciplines that work with young people, of showing them that care. And very important is that young people are very attuned and sensitive to that. They know when somebody shows them care because they have to as part of the job, or when somebody takes that extra step of what do you need, what can I do for you, and it is not dependent on the project. And that's something which I really try to ensure that the young people are clear that I care about them most of all beyond my PhD, which can be controversial in some respect, but for me that's my core value as a person, as a researcher, of how do I make sure that their well-being and their emotional needs are addressed at every point of the project.
Yeah, it's so important. And I think it really harks back to, particularly in the West, there's been a lot of archaic ideas of research that feel very extractive, and on both sides, I've been part of research projects as the researcher where I'm interviewing someone for one thing in a former job, getting all the insights from them, and then goodbye, thanks for sharing your trauma, never see you again. And I think what's really beautiful about what you do, the way we're trying to practice secrets, is this idea of actually forget about survivor, non-survivor, forget about young person, adult, whatever. At the crux of it, we are all people. And how do we give that same level of humility and respect? Of course, like with secrets, sometimes the thing that we have a lot is the struggle of deadlines. So we're always really, really flexible with people on our deadlines. And we recognize that re-triggering can happen, that no one's going to die if a deadline isn't completed. But at the same time, we have to manage work going out so that we can help future survivors. So we're always trying to balance that kind of line. But the reason why we're balancing that line is because first and foremost, we see the person as having agency of themselves and their story, not as us as a content platform consistently churning out this work. Because what is the point if that comes at the expense to the person? And it's really nice to see that, again, I think because of your Filipino values, that those are starting to be shaped in the work that you do, and other people who read and hear about your work get inspired by.
We both would know like trauma manifests differently across people, and that's why I think the care-based approach is really important on how do we show care for people who are going through different things, that they might experience things which they might not consider as traumatic, but it manifests in other ways. That's why genuine listening, care, empathy, and support consistently, regardless if they disclose or not, is a trauma-informed approach, and giving them the choice and control which they often don't have is very important, especially when they do disclose and there's a lot of expectations of what is trauma for them. Others might expect them to manifest it differently. Like in another project, some young people were saying that they didn't receive support anymore from the school because the school felt that they were okay. They weren't manifesting external signs of trauma, whatever symptoms those are. And that just reminds me of, that's why care is a central value, that it's not dependent on someone's diagnosis or someone disclosing that they're feeling trauma, but just that care of, we know they experienced this, so they might be dealing with it in different ways, and not expecting a linear model of, you experienced this, you went through therapy, now trauma is done. No, trauma is continuous. So that's why embedding those are very important in my practice of care-based and trauma-informed approaches I see in your work as well, which is really inspiring.
Thank you. You too. I'm inspired by you too. I think it's really important, given that we both practice work in this topic, to recognize vicarious trauma. You mentioned it earlier as something that is, a risk when you do this work. Can you explain to us what vicarious trauma is and how you as a practitioner try to protect yourself from that?
Okay, so vicarious trauma is, how I understand, is when someone talks about their experience or even about the topic and they experience some distress or discomfort of my own. For instance, in my PhD, I experienced some situations in my adult life that connects a lot to the topic of sexual violence. So they had to make decisions at some point of my PhD. They had to take a pause for emotional well-being. And as with many decisions I made, it was care for myself. And at the same time, doing justice to the young people of how can I expect to give them justice and do meaningful work with them when I know that I'm being burnt out and I'm being affected by the topic. So well-being of practitioners and researchers is always very important, even if sometimes it can be not a priority for others who are very focused on deadlines, and it's nothing on anyone else. It's just important to remember that as we practice care for other people, care for ourselves is very important. So when I took that break, I talked to the young people, that without delving into detail, because of course I don't want them to also, that like maybe we all need a break because we've been doing this for months, and then let's recharge and let's recalibrate and restart at a different time. Same with my supervisors who were very supportive. So it's very important, I think, to have that space for well-being and consider it as a risk. I remember when I was doing my risk assessment as part of the ethics application, my supervisor said, you wrote a lot of risks for the young people, but what about yourself? That needs to be in place. And I think that's an important reminder. And I'm very lucky and grateful to be working with supervisors who always tell me to prioritize my emotional well-being, because that's not always the case in some practitioner and research environments, which are so focused on efficiency and productivity at the cost of the person. So in my thesis and how I always say that we are people first, researchers second, and that applies to any profession that we have. We all, as I practice the care-based approach and my ethos for caring for young people and others, I realize how important it is to practice that for myself. And it's a good reminder for everyone that as outwardly as we want to show everyone that their well-being is important, ours is as well, because I think that's the best way we can work with young people if we feel we are emotionally balanced and emotionally stable, then we can work in a more meaningful and just way with them.
As you were speaking, I thought quite intensely about. I had a situation last year where I was speaking with a younger person about sexual violence, and I was using my own story as kind of like a case study, I suppose. And I was really happy to do that, and I was, very boundaried with it. But I noticed that I think because the young person was so interested, like so wanting to know more, like she kept asking questions that perhaps like pushed that boundary without me realizing. So for example, why didn't you respond in this way when that thing happened? And it might have come from a question of curiosity, but it wasn't what I was ready to talk about, and it felt very accusative. And I found myself at that time kind of holding it back, but noticing that I was, as you said, like, but the body recognizes how it feels, right? I was shaking a little bit, like underneath, and not in a way that anyone would notice, but I was starting to get kind of like a nervous sweat. And I kept remember thinking, a part of me is feeling a bit uncomfortable about this, but there's a young person asking me questions about sexual violence. Therefore, let me suppress everything and like create a situation where they can, get the answers that they need. And yeah, in the direct moment, that might have been the best course of action in the short term, but actually in the long term, what does that do? It signals to that younger person that perhaps asking these questions are okay when they might not be, like if the person's boundaries crossed. It signifies that I might create a pattern where I consistently lower myself or my own needs in order to further the needs of other people. And I think, as you said, we all in some degree have had an experience of sexual violence or harm, and that can come up in different times when you work with people with different stories. So I think it's just a case of really doing the work to notice where your needs and boundaries are not being met, and also how can you have significant break between the work. When I'm recording film clubs or podcasts, I can really see visibly the difference from when I am really rested and engaged and motivated into this work versus when I'm exhausted. I see the flakes of eczema around my eyes and my nose. For me, that's my like physical response. And it really is just a reminder, like, wow, okay, this work sadly is not going anywhere. Like, there is always going to be some form of this issue to tackle, but I don't want to like fall off the cliff before I get to see the work shine,
It surprises a lot of people, and even myself, of how much this type of work is really emotional labor. The fact that we are sharing ourselves with the young people, we're learning from them their stories, and just that whole process of relationship building, it all takes emotion, of vulnerability, as you were saying earlier, of honesty, transparency. All of that can lead into exhaustion, and it doesn't mean that it means we don't want to do it anymore, but just those breaks and debriefing, or just having that space, is very important. And to add to what you were reflecting on, is an important part in my practice, which I realized, is those reflections after the encounters, even just jotting them down and being kind to myself. Of, I might have decided this way, but looking back, I would have done differently. But telling myself at that moment, I had the information. I can only decide at the moment, because I cannot tell the young person, wait, let me give 5 minutes to. So it's just like a lot of things is, I think, very important for practitioners and researchers working with young people and on these topics, to also be kind to ourselves and not be too hard when we act or decide on things in the moment, and looking back that we would have done differently. I think it's just that reflection of a learning point that maybe in the future I will do that differently. Because I remember before, there were times when I questioned myself a lot and I talked to my supervisor, should have I done this? Should I have done that? And they keep telling me, at that moment when the young people are in front of you, you only know what you know, and you can only decide with how you feel. But it's good to log those and just reflect and be like, okay, this is why I did it at the time, and why I thought it was a good idea. Next time, maybe I will do differently, or what have I learned from this? So it's just that constant reflection, which I think sometimes gets lost in the process when everyone is working to a deadline to produce something, that we just move from one task to the other. There's no reflection in between. That's why I think taking space in between, as you were saying, for me, for example, workshops or interviews or anything with young people, to just have that space to be like, okay, let me take a breather before I move on to the next task. Because I think if there's no reflection, we will just keep going and churning things without really learning from the emotional, relational part of the process. So it's really
Absolutely.
good that you reflected on yours as well, which I know you're very reflective.
Oh, yes, girl. I have this whole book in my downstairs, which is literally every time a major moment or a situation like that happens, I just put everything that I learned and what I would have done differently. And it's just become my sort of like guiding star for all of this work. I wanted to move on a bit now to talk about
Mhm.
our Asian heritages. So,
Yes.
of course, you're Filipina living in Durham. I'm British Vietnamese, so I've got roots in Vietnam culture. And I think for both of us, that has played such a pivotal role in the way that we approach this work. And you always talk to me about the Filipino values. So, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what they are.
In Filipino culture, we have several values and virtues. But what I just learned recently is that there are two core virtues that underpin all other values. So first is loob, which is inside. What is your core as a person? What values, what principles, what ethos guides you in everything you do. So for me, it's about care, relationships, humility, respect for others. So it means that when there are two things which are in tension with each other, I return to that value. Next is kapwa, which translation would be shared self. How do you have a shared identity with others? So together, those are very important in what my inner core as a person is about care and concern and empathy for others. So that affects how I see others as my kapwa, as another person who is different from me, but also the same, of seeing that equality, or maybe not equality, more of shared humanity between us. So to apply all of those in my work is seeing young people as different but not so different than me, of challenging those normal imbalances that the adult knows everything, the adult will decide. So I try to change that by seeing them as having a shared identity with me, of we are all trying to learn things together, do things together. So with those two values, they are connected to values of concern, empathy, respect for others' different opinions, and also generosity. For instance, in Filipino culture, we have a value called kabutihang loob, meaning you are generous to others with no expectation of return. So for instance, in my PhD, I when I go to conferences or trips, I bring back gifts for the young people, which I'm like, I thought of you while I was in Iceland. I brought you a puffin toy. So these are little things to show that I care for them. I am outside of the research space. So these are important values because when they are compared, or when they're compared to Western values of incentives and compensation, of I'm giving this to you because I want you to participate, compared to I'm giving this to you because I care about you. I don't mind if you don't want to join anymore, but I want you to know that I am thankful for your presence here. So those two values are how I reflect on, or how I usually reflect on it, like what drives me when I relate with the young people. It's always been Filipino cultural values, and how I practice them, how I inform them, but also how I integrate them with the Western, I don't want to call it West and North or anything, but with the values that I've learned in a British institution. And what I really found fulfilling is how applying those values allowed me to connect to British young people. Because I was really worried how I'm not a young person, I'm not British. So how do I connect with them? But because of those, of showing them care through food, games, and just chats, we were able to find a connection that transcends culture and transcends differences in identities and personality. And that's where the Filipino value of kapwa, shared identity, comes in, that we are all in this space trying to work and learn together. And how does that work between us, regardless of our differences, or our differences make it a richer experience. So those are some of the reflections I've had in working with British young people and young people in general. Of I've learned that even when I work with Hong Kong or people or even other European children, those values are translatable, and they are, because I think they're very intrinsic and they're very rooted in emotions and relationships, which I feel would connect with anyone regardless of their ethnicity or their other intersecting identities.
just comparing it with Vietnamese culture, every time I do a speech or visit a school or go over to Vietnam and, do this work, I will always get given a random gift. And it's always, and this will be, after I've either decided to do the thing for free, like as a volunteer, or I've agreed to be paid for the work. But the gift is always an additional, and thank you so much for doing that. And so similarly, when I do events, particularly in Vietnam, I was buying smoothies for all of the team and making sure everyone had fruits. And in the early versions of Secrets Worth Sharing, we would always provide a free meal to anybody who came to our events. And unfortunately, we can't do that as much now. But it was such a nice, to me, it was really obvious. And, I'm from a culture where we were brought up to be you don't host a party unless you can feed and entertain people. So that was just an extension of my karaoke potluck vibes of growing up, bringing that into Secrets Worth Sharing. You don't expect people to come and learn about childhood sexual abuse if you're not also going to share your own experiences or your own learnings, or make this a comfortable environment to be in. And what does comfortable even mean? We often talk about safe space in this sector, and I think that can sometimes be quite a condescending way to frame that, because who are we to decide that a space is safe enough for someone else to speak? But what we can control is how comfortable a space can be. And I think it's really sweet when I hear that you're doing that and you're giving gifts to the young people you work with, and that there's ways that these cultural ways of being just naturally flit in and out of the work we do, because it's us as people, right?
Yes, definitely. So food is always the best way to connect with people.
Always.
I used to work in a charity which worked with children and young people who experience different forms of abuse, including sexual abuse. And when I talk to young people, there's two narratives that usually come up. First is, of course, they talk about their experience and how that made them feel. But what also struck me a lot and inspired the work that I'm doing here now is that they talk with a lot of hope. They talk about their aspirations for the future, that after they've finished school and left the institution, they want to help other young people like them. And I think that really transformed the way I see sexual violence, sexual abuse when I talk to young people. Because before that, I've always felt like, how would it affect them for the rest of their lives? And which I see people that, of course, it's we don't know how trauma manifests. But when talking to those young people and the survivors, and they just focus on the hope, they focus on the life after, I'm like, it's not for me to focus on the impact that's happened to them in a negative manner, but also focus on hope. And I think that's what's informed my work here. So when I talk to British young people, I apply that same concept of everyone in this room may have experienced different things. We don't have to disclose anything, but we can talk about what do we want to do about it. What is our vision for other young people who experience this? And I think bringing the stories of the young Filipino young people I've worked with and engaged, it's not that I bring their stories, it's just bringing those narratives of hope for a future allows me to also connect with the young people here of we are working together on solutions, what can be done, how can we prevent things. And the lived experiences all, of course, inform that, but it's also harnessing that into a vision of hope. For example, for one group of young people, they said, what schools do we want? How can schools be more responsive? So I think for both groups of young people, it's been interesting how culturally, of course, different, that with the Filipino young people and children young people, they're able, of course, to share with me in a more direct manner. I think because culturally there's that language, but also because we were in a space where everyone was encouraged to talk about it. Well, here in the UK, because I did take that specific decision that we talk about it in a more hypothetical, indirect manner, I learned about their experiences in a different way, but both are still informed by the narrative of we want a better future for everyone, for themselves and for others. So I think that's been really helpful. And I think what I really want is that in the future I can do this type of research in the Philippines. It's really the hope and dream that I have of I wasn't allowed to do it before due to systematic reasons, and they said it's not possible, but now I can show it is possible, that we can do it in a way that's trauma informed, relational, ethical. So I think bringing that experience and working with young people and showing the possibilities of how they can engage, I think would be really the dream of harnessing all of those stories and all of those amazing contributions into something of everyone wants a better future on addressing sexual violence that involves young people front and center as partners.
Regardless of culture, young people know how prevalent this issue is. Everyone's
Yes.
either got a friend or gone through this experience themselves. I remember once I was sitting in a cafe in Vietnam and this kid, Vietnamese, English speaking as well, was reading behind my shoulder what I was doing. And he genuinely said to me, he can't have been older than 9, 10. And he said, oh, if you want to learn more about the experience of rape, you should come with me to a public school in Vietnam. Like, there is no, like, it's such a common experience for us here. Like, you know, just don't worry about it. And I was genuinely taken aback by how blasé he said this. And then I was speaking with some younger people here and they were like, but we all know this, you know, it's not like, you know, and that's the thing that's really important to remember is as older people, we are always behind from their conversations. There might be things that people aren't comfortable to tell us when they're younger, or, you know, they're bound by so much power that is out of their control, be it their family, be it the law, be it school systems, whatever. And so just really remembering that there are these structures in place that can aid silence. And what unifies all children is the knowledge deeply that there is something wrong, and there are certain behaviors that feel wrong, even if we can't put a name to them. I think for me, I don't do work with children in the UK or in a formal setting with kids in Vietnam, but I can talk about the different cultural sides of it. And when you were talking about the Filipino pillar of generosity, of course, that was very similar to the gifts giving culture and everything like that. So the shared self-value is really, really similar to the idea of harmony in Vietnamese culture and the idea of like, we are all part of a wider whole. That can be really detrimental in some ways when, you know, you're less able to feel like you can be an individual part of yourself if that doesn't conform to the harmony of what is accepted.
Yeah.
But there is something really beautiful about looking up for your neighbours, showing solidarity, showing care. I've become obsessed with this quote in the past week. Someone said to me, if you want to be part of a village, you have to allow yourself to be a villager. I don't know the origins of this quote. I wish I did, but it really struck true. And I thought, yeah, like sometimes, you know, we want to build communities. We want to be part of these communities, but we don't want all the bad stuff that comes along with it. And I think particularly in Vietnamese culture, there is almost the flip side of that. It's like, we're part of a community, we're part of a culture, no matter what. And it's the no matter that can be detrimental. So I find it really fascinating to kind of talk about this issue in those different places and see how they get interpreted. And there are always things that one can learn from the other.
Yeah, I think that also connects to some of my reflections in Filipino culture about the sense of community. That because everyone wants harmony and community, and unintentionally something leads to silencing of difficult situations. For instance, in Filipino culture, as much as young people and everyone agrees that it's prevalent, I think there's still a lot of taboo and shame and just silence on anything related to sexual behaviors. So if something does happen to someone, and it's usually within the family, no one can talk about it. They would just hide it didn't happen. Or even when they talk about it to someone like the police, the family will tell them to just retract the story. So I think that's some of the cultural values which can sometimes play out differently. As you said, like we want harmony and community and helping each other. But sometimes because of the constant quest for harmony, it can sometimes affect the young person. For instance, I just wrote a paper on child sexual abuse might play out here in the UK for Filipino or Southeast Asian communities. And because of that value of harmony, there are some instances wherein if children do experience abuse, they might not tell anyone or they would not disclose because it could affect the immigration status of their family or their mother if the perpetrator is someone who can affect the visa status. So it's a lot of sometimes families or even children, it's mostly families, make those decisions of what values do we want. We want to protect the child, of course, but if this gets out, then the whole family might be in peril. So I think it's just navigating those different decisions and different situations. That's when you ask me what's the difference of British culture and Filipino culture. It now made me think there's also the third one of Southeast Asians or Asians who are here in the UK, and how do we support them? How do we make sure that, how are they navigating all of this? Because they, similar to us, they bring cultural values here in a different context, which but those values might conflict along with family harmony, autonomy, agency. So I think it's a lot of those reflections of those migrant young people, and how are they doing? How are they supporting when they're straddling two worlds, two identities, but at the same time wanting to do the best for themselves as individuals, yet also prioritizing their family and the community. So it's just a lot of things to reflect on this. And this is a type of work which I would absolutely love to do in the future, of representing the experiences of Southeast Asian children in the UK. Because a lot of the research and practice now is focused on Asian children, but mostly with South Asian heritage, which is expected because of the proportion of families and young people in the UK. But there's a growing population of East and Southeast children and young people, and there's very little known on what are their experiences of sexual violence, how do they navigate these cultural values when it is in tension with immigration, precarity, and a lot of the structural issues. What does family mean in practice when you also experience abuse? A lot of things to think about, which I think it's good that we have React, the network, to have that space to represent the perspectives of young people and also those working with them.
It's really, well, I was going to say funny. It's not funny at all. But there was a knowledge review that was published as part of the CSA Centre by Sukhwant Dhaliwal. And she was looking at, this exact situation, how does the experience of ethnic minority, or what she called African, Caribbean and Asian heritage children, play out in the UK. It was typically looking at diaspora communities. So the communities that you said that, might have roots in one place but live here. And the biggest group that was missing, that she struggled to find any literature on, was East and Southeast Asian, and then it was African groups. So there's still a lot of silence and stigma around there. And I totally hear what you're saying. And I think we also need to add the additional fact that if, you're a migrant, you're considering your settlement status, all of those things, the children in those communities end up growing up quite quick. There's a lot of my friends have all had experience of being the one that fills in the doctor's forms or who does all the translating, and that element of childhood just becomes normalized to them, that they do a lot of the admin that an adult would do, or if it's claiming benefits, it's going along with their parent to the job center or whatever it is. And so when you also add in the fact that there might be, child violence along with all of that, and then a fear to kind of disclose that because you are so busy being the adult and almost looking after the parents themselves, what do you do in that situation? So and that is something that I don't think comes across as much when you are living within East and Southeast Asian countries and have your roots there as well. There's that kind of added element of a diaspora children. And that's why I think the work that is done by groups like On Your Side is so important, which is a East and Southeast Asian hate crime reporting service. Because again, some of the hate crimes are sexually motivated, not all of them. But if we understand where this hate comes from and start tackling that as well, you do just get to naturally the point of ending sexual violence as well, because you're understanding where the roots of those structures. In this section, we're going to talk about some do's and don'ts for when you're researching with, talking with, working with children and young people. Janelle, I wondered if you wanted to start us off with any don'ts.
Okay, first is don't decide everything for them and make them do things in the research just to fulfill any of the responsibilities. Because it's good to give them the space to share the decision making and the control and the choice of how they want to participate, anytime they want to opt out or to pause their participation.
My first don't is don't say, let us handle this now. I think particularly parents or guardians, when they say something like that to a child, it comes from a place of care. They want to say, let us handle this now because you've gone through so much and let us take this burden. I think what they forget is that the experience of harm has been that child or young person's experience for years. So it might be that you're just finding out about it now as the older person. You go instantly into shock, instantly into anger, instantly into whatever emotion, and you want to just protect that child. Whereas they might feel like they have been protecting you from this knowledge and secret for so long. So don't say, let us handle it now. Instead, bring them in on these conversations and what they would like to happen next.
I think it's very important. And another don't is don't assume to know how trauma manifests in the young person and what they want done next. So this is very important because young people have different experiences across the continuum. Could be something every day with another young person, could be very severe, but trauma could appear at different points in their life. So it's important not to assume that if a young person looks like they're adjusting well, then they're okay. So don't assume to know how they feel. And also don't impose anything them that they should do this because they're already feeling better or anything. So it's really important to give them the space and the agency to decide how trauma is affecting their lives and what support they would need.
Absolutely. I love that one. It's very similar to what I was going to say is don't take away things that are important to their everyday lives. So what I mean by that is we are hearing on the news all the time about how damaging Roblox, for example, can be as a site for grooming children, or how children are often targeted via email, or there's this scam that's going around at the moment about homework or whatever. I think sometimes the instant reaction of an adult can be, right, we're taking away your phone, we're taking away your email, we're taking away your Roblox. And what that does is that punishes the child for something that they haven't even done or behavior that has happened to them. It would be like us saying, oh my gosh, you're not doing very well at your job, so we're going to take away all the internet for like all of the internet. Or not even that, because in that situation, that would require you doing the bad thing. Like the kid isn't doing anything wrong, or they might be curious and engaging in behaviors that you don't like. But actually, what we should be doing is having healthier conversations as opposed to banning things without, because for the child, that is a whole element of their life, their social network, everything to them. And so they might not want to tell you anything because they fear that they are going to be the ones punished and that resources that they have available to them are going to be taken away. And particularly when it's a child talking with adults, we need to recognize the power that we can have in significantly affecting their day-to-day lives.
No, that's really important and connects to the next don't that I have. So the last one is don't claim to be the expert in young people's lives. It's the common saying of, I've been there, I've done that, I'm adult, I know how to be a young person. It's just recognizing the reality that young people's lives are so different with technology, with online spaces. What does dating, relationship mean for them? Situationship, so many words, so many terms. So the more adults assume to know, the less that they're attuned to young people's realities. It's important to be curious, to ask young people, what does this mean to you? What does being a young person mean? Instead of just imposing that my parents did this with me, I'm going to do this with you. This is how we've been brought about. It's recognizing it's a different generation and adopting that learning role of it's important to learn together with the young people instead of telling them right or wrong, because it's not as clear cut as it might have been before, because now there's so many gray areas in what is harmful or not. So it's good to navigate that space along with young people.
Shall we move to some more positive do's?
Yeah, my first do is always to listen to young people. And by listen, I mean actually listen to not only their words, but even their actions and what they're trying to say. That when they say that when they say feelings, something might feel weird, good, or anything, is giving them that space that they can talk, they can feel listened to, and that someone is genuinely interested in what they have to say and not just a checkbox to be like, okay, I ask you how you are. So the more they feel listened to, the more they trust adults and other people, that when something does happen to them, they know that they can feel reassured that this person would listen and give and respect them when they tell them anything, and would also respect their decisions when the time comes.
Mine is very similar. Do show an active interest in things they care about. you know, they don't have to be things you absolutely love doing, but it's a really, really beautiful way of just spending time with a young person in your life, is to get to know their world, right? The number of countless anime conversations I've had with like my younger cousins, for example, of shows that I've not even seen, but it's really
Yeah.
fun, and like they just like that I'm showing an interest or asking questions. You know, it doesn't mean that we start saying like skibbity toilet or like whatever the slang is that they use. That's probably cringe, and we'll do the reverse. But you know, just showing that they too are an expert of their own
Yeah.
lives. And so if we just ask questions about their lives, that opens up such a beautiful pathway. And in the same way, when we talk about abuse, you know, you said earlier, like, we should never claim to be experts in what it's like to be young in this generation. I completely agree. And so asking them, you know, how has this been impacted by like the online stuff? Or like, do you think about this a lot in your day to day? Like, what else is bothering you? You know, those kinds of things. You might not get things right, but showing a curious approach is always going to be better than assumptive and patronizing one.
No, I definitely agree with everything you said, and it connects to my do take them seriously. Like when they say something, consider as valid and not, as you saying, not be patronizing and be like, no, I know better. They do have a lot of brilliant ideas and perspectives and experiences, and they just need the space that someone will listen to them and think, yeah, that's a good idea, that can inform what I'm doing, what I know, and recognizing that they have a lot of knowledge and they have ideas based on the lives they're living now, which as adults we wouldn't know unless we listen to them and take them seriously and act on things they recommend or things they say needs to be changed. So it's just that constant dialogue of asking them what matters to you, how can we make sure that what matters to you is prioritized in the actions we are taking. I think that's something that needs to be embedded in all of the things we do, and not only in research or practice, but even in the home. When adults or families ask like, what do you want to do for vacation, or what, it starts there in our own homes. Of like, as I remember in coming from an Asian household, we don't get a lot we don't get asked a lot of what we want, but it's very important to be asked, what do you want, what matters to you, and someone just being like, yeah, I will take that seriously.
Retweet, I hear it there. I was going to say a similar one was, do you recognize the generational age gap? I think there's nothing more powerful than saying, I obviously grew up at a really different time to you. You're 9, I'm 29 or whatever. And I really just want to understand what things are like for you, and that can create a really nice way for you to start to compare experiences without them being patronizing. So for example, you know, I did a podcast on old people and childhood sexual abuse. What does old people mean? In this case, I was interviewing someone who was 73, right? And he was talking about what it felt like to be abused at the time of the 60s and the 70s. And that is an era I have no recollection of. And obviously, all I knew about it was that they didn't have TV and internet in the way that we did, right?
Yeah.
But more than that, I wanted to understand the sentiment. And when he was talking about that, I was able to compare what it was like for me in the noughties watching tweenies or whatever, or how pop music and like MTV would like get banned in our household because it was too sexual, and open up those conversations. And similarly now, you know, I think 3 scrolls on a YouTube short or on TikTok, and you're already seeing like quite suggestive material. And what must that be like? Do kids even recognize that as being suggestive? Has our bar moved? So again, like recognizing the age difference can actually do so much for real, honest conversation.
No, I totally understand that. It's similar to what everything you were saying. And to add to that on a different track is, do have fun with them and connect. Because a lot of the times, because we're talking about sensitive topics on sexual violence, we might feel that it has to be always serious. And it's really applying your concept of serious joy. It is possible to have joy and have fun with young people, and it doesn't detract from the seriousness of the topic or the project. It's by engaging with them through food, through games, through just conversations of fun. It actually helps create that environment where they feel comfortable, that, okay, I can feel a bit relaxed and comfortable before talking about sensitive topics. And even at the end, having that fun again to sandwich the serious stuff in the middle really helps form those bonds. So it's important to have joy when doing this type of work and just have fun and make those connections with the young people as we are continuing to talk with them.
Yeah, my final do is use age appropriate language. We are
Yeah.
not saying you have to use the word sex, rape,
Mhm.
whatever with a child who's 3 years old, you know? That is not the case. But what we are saying is that conversations around healthy relationships, safety, consent, and emotions should be starting from as young as the child can talk. And I really recommend people here to Lexi, the body safety expert online. And she does so many incredible videos about, for example, we wear underwear over our private parts because they are sensitive, and that's why they're private, because until we're able to get to an age where we can understand why they're sensitive and use them appropriately, we need to protect them and cover them, and that's for our safety but also for other people's, in the same way that you would wear a helmet if you're going on your bike. And she uses these really clear analogies, and I think it's really fantastic. And even that, as a simple conversation, can really, really start the whole safety conversation. So, don't use the fact that a child's age might be too old or too young to your context to determine whether or not you should give them valuable information about their own safety. We are all entitled to body autonomy, and that includes the language that we use.
No, I totally agree with that. And that's why my do would be connected to language as well, of validate and young people's language as valid, even if they use different terms or concepts which are different to what adults are usually using, especially in terms of sexual violence. Listen to it and consider them as valuable, that they might communicate about their experiences in ways that are more casual or emotional, but all of these are very important. So it's seeing their language, their contributions, and their perspectives as valuable, valid, and important is really the core of this work, of seeing them as people, as partners, as contributors who have many, many things, important contributions to make everyone safer and everyone more supported.
Absolutely. We're all learning and we're all teachers at the same time,
Yes,
right?
exactly. Yes.
Oh, I love that. I also love that we just kept being like, and another one, because
Yeah.
this topic is so
And we're just
rich.
building.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Janelle, for your time and just coming to speak with me. I know we're both speaking on some dark, wintry day in the UK, and this has really just brought a bit of light to my day. So thank you so much.
No, thank you so much for making the time and for inviting me. It's really good to have this opportunity and to really learn from you, and the similarities not only for work but also how we bring our cultural values and the joy into our work.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, until next time, bye.
Yes, bye. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to yet another iconic episode of Secrets Worth Sharing. I'm just dropping in here now to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe on all the platforms, most notably Instagram, let's be for real, at Secrets Worth Sharing _. And you know the score. If you want updates on any of the resources, links mentioned here, blogs, media, and links to our events, go to our website, www.secretsworthsharing.com. Also, rate this podcast, ideally 5 stars, give it a like on YouTube. All of that really helps us to drive up funding so we can keep producing this iconic, engaging, and community-minded material. And with serious joy, bye.